Hey everybody, let's continue our conversation of Plato's Gorgias. So early in this dialogue, Socrates makes quick work of Gorgias and Polus. He takes Gorgias down by demonstrating that Gorgias doesn't actually know the things he claims to teach. Polus actually gets tripped up on the definitions of words. So Socrates gets Polus to admit that doing injustice is shameful, and then he gets him to define the shameful as something that's either painful or evil. And since doing injustice isn't necessarily painful, in fact it can lead to pleasure, then doing injustice must in fact be more evil. But in fairness, this isn't really a knockout blow. It really feels as if Socrates has kind of tripped Polus up in definitions, right? Spun him around. And this is where Callicles enters the argument. And Callicles is kind of like the boss in a video game or something, right? He's the real opponent. And he presents himself as the real opponent because he presents himself as being willing to say the things that the previous interlocutors were unwilling to say. The problem with Gorgias and Polus, and both Callicles and Socrates agreed to this, is that they were ashamed to make the argument they actually wanted to make. And so they stop short of saying what they really think. That does not seem to be a problem for Callicles. So Socrates immediately starts trying to pin Callicles down. He gets Callicles to advance the position that the strong should rule the weak, and the superior should rule the inferior. So Socrates does his Socrates thing, and he says, well, okay, what do you mean by better? And what do you mean by superior? Do you mean the stronger? And Callicles says, yeah, better, superior, stronger, they're all the same thing. So Socrates says, okay, so when the many band together, then they're many and they're the strongest party, and then they can impose their will on any individual person, right? But Callicles says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I don't mean some band of garbage people should rule over the virtuous few. So then it becomes clear when Callicles says superior, he doesn't really mean stronger, at least not in terms of force. So Socrates goes back to definitions. He says, okay, well, what do you mean by better? Do you mean the most intelligent? And Callicles says, yes, that's what I mean, the most intelligent. The most intelligent should rule over their inferiors, and they should get a greater share of goods. And then, I love this part. Socrates says, okay, so what goods are you talking about? Do you mean like food? So that the most intelligent people should get like the most food? And Callicles is like, this guy. And then Socrates goes on and he says, okay, so what? Do you mean like clothes? Like the most intelligent should get the most clothes? Again, Socrates is trying to get Callicles to be specific here. How should goods and benefits be distributed among the many and the few, or among the great and the general population? Callicles still doesn't answer specifically. Instead, he modifies his position. And he says, look, Socrates, what I'm saying is the people who are most intelligent and bravest should rule everyone else. What you really want to be, according to Gorgias and Polus and Callicles, is a person who understands that justice is for other people. That real freedom and real happiness is recognizing that the rules don't apply to you. Socrates perceives at least that Callicles is going in this direction, and he raises the idea of self-control. Callicles talks all about ruling others, but Socrates says, well, what about ruling yourself? And then Callicles says, why would anyone want to rule themselves? Why would you want to restrain your appetites? Life should really be about satisfying all of your desires as frequently as possible. And this is where we get into the discussion of the life of pleasure. Plato suggests to us that this is the crux of the argument, because he has Socrates say, the way you pursue your argument, speaking frankly as you do, certainly does you credit, Callicles, for you are now saying clearly what others are thinking but are unwilling to say. Callicles says that the continual satisfaction of our desires is really the path towards happiness. This is essentially the same thing that Thomas Hobbes says centuries later. Continual success in obtaining those things which a man from time to time desireth, that is to say, continual prospering, is that men call felicity. Socrates counters Callicles by giving us this extraordinary image of leaky jars. He says, imagine two people, and one has these jars that he fills up, and once he fills them up, he's satisfied. He has everything he needs. But then imagine another person with a leaky jar. That person has to keep filling their jar up and up, because as soon as it's full, it empties out again. He puts this image to Callicles, and he says, would you rather be the person with the leaky jar, that has to keep continually working to fill it back up, or the person with the full jars, who's satisfied with his full jars? Then Socrates gives us another image, and I think this one is really effective. Socrates says, imagine a person who's really itchy, and has some kind of itch that he has to scratch over and over and over again. He gets to scratch his whole life. And Socrates suggests this is the life that Callicles is describing. Just the life of a perpetually itchy person. Even talking about it makes me itchy. And the point Socrates is trying to make here is, don't you need to discriminate between good and bad pleasures? That some pleasures are good for you and some pleasures are bad for you. Or some pleasures are good for you in the right amount, but bad for you in excess. Now Callicles knows he's in trouble here, but he won't admit it. And so Socrates has to go about demonstrating that pleasure is not the good. He does this with an image of a sick eye. He says that someone's eyes can't be healthy and sick in the same way at the same time, so that when an eye becomes healthy, it loses its sickness, and when it becomes sick, it loses its health. So these two opposite states of the badness of an eye and the goodness of an eye can't coexist simultaneously. And this seems to make sense. You can't be nauseous and not nauseous at the same time. Your right index finger can't be broken and not broken. And then Socrates pivots to start talking about hunger and thirst. So Socrates gets us to imagine the state of drinking. And he says, well, when the thirsty person drinks, doesn't that person simultaneously feel the pain of thirst and the pleasure of drinking? Don't those two states coexist at the same time? And isn't it the case that as soon as the pain of thirst goes away, the pleasure of drinking also goes away? So the point here is that if pleasure and pain can coexist at the same time in the same activity, then they can't correspond to good and bad, because those two states can't coexist in the same way at the same time. So ultimately, Socrates is able to take the dialogue back to some of the arguments advanced earlier, because it appears that organizing your human life or organizing a political community around just principles requires that we understand which goods are best, which goods are the most good, and it requires that we're able to organize and distribute those goods appropriately. And that requires knowledge of the good and of the various goods.